notification from our friends at Zoom saying that this session is being recorded. So hopefully that's okay with you guys. And if not, just, go off camera and that'll be okay. And it won't record your face, but I appreciate those that are on camera. So hello. Everybody's here, just doing a couple of last minute check-ins. And I am so glad everybody's here today again. We've recorded. So I feel like we've had a load of people join in. So welcome again. If you haven't already, please put your name and agency in the chat and we're going to get started. So thumbs up. Hopefully you can all see my screen. Thank you all so much. And like I shared at the beginning just a moment ago, today we're talking about financial hardships in racial disparities in the ALICE data and really in our society. That's kind of what we're seeing, is our reality now. So my name is Jessica Davison, for those that I have not met before, so welcome. And joining me today is Tiffany Echeverria.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you. Hi. So we're both glad you're here. And if you haven't already, I've said it before, say it again, please share your name and agency in the chat. And just as a housekeeping note, we are recording. And so after this session, we will share the recording along with the PowerPoint slides and then a load of resources after the session. I know there's quite a bit of content we're going to cover through today, different reports out there about these topics. And so we'll share all of this with you afterward. And so ALICE as data is powerful, but ALICE is also about people. It's likely that you've been, you are, or you know someone who's ALICE. And today is the intersection of financial hardship and racial disparities, and this is our reality. And as we get started, we really wanted to ground ourselves in the awareness and acknowledge that through this poem by Maya Angelou. So like many other civil rights activists, Maya Angelou was working to create equity among the human family and wanted to ensure that all people had rights no matter what race they were. And this poem specifically addresses the differences among people from around the world. So.
Human family. I note the obvious differences in the human family. Some of us are serious. Some thrive on comedy.
So sorry.
Some declare their lives are lived as true profundity, and others claim they really live the real reality. The variety of our skin tones can confuse bemused delight, brown and pink and beige and purple, tan and blue and white. I've sailed upon the 7 seas and stopped in every land. I've seen the wonders of the world, not yet one common man. I know 10,000 women called Jane and Mary Jane. I've not seen any two who really were the same. Mirror twins are different, although their features jibe, and lovers think quite different thoughts while lying side by side. We love and lose in China. We weep on England's moors and laugh and moan in Guinea and thrive on Spanish shores. We seek success in Finland, are born and die in Maine. In minor ways we differ, in major we're the same. I note the obvious differences between each sort and type, but we are more alike, my friends, than we are unalike. We are more alike, my friends, than we are unalike. We are more alike, my friends, than we are unalike. Human family.
Okay, so we are more alike than we are unalike. You know, I really want us to hold that and ground us as we go into this session. So thank you, and I'm going to hand it off to Tiffany.
Hello again. So my name is Tiffany Echeverria, and I am a teammate of Jessica at United Way of Greater Houston. And I'm going to spare you from me turning on my camera, one, so that I have really flawless connectivity and you can hear me clearly, but also two, I am wrapped up in every blanket and warm fuzzy thing I have in my house to keep me toasty on this very chilly day. So thank you again, Jessica, for starting us off with that poem and really bringing in the word human. That can almost be the word of the day. Alice data refers to human beings. It's important to acknowledge that and carry that forward with respect and sensitivity. When we turn to Alice data, we often focus on the individual family needs and experience. That is a very valuable discussion. However, today we're centering ourselves or organizing ourselves in a larger context at the systems level. We want to start with this framing that comes from the Racial Equity Institute's groundwater approach. The groundwater approach is based on several key observations about racial inequity. Racial inequity looks the same across systems. We just call it different things. Socioeconomic differences does not explain the racial inequities that we see. Systems contribute significantly to disparities. The terminology displayed on the slide provides language or labels to describe the racial disparities across systems that commonly touch our work. Let's examine how racial inequities present themselves through various systems and take a closer look before we connect this to the work we are going to be speaking about around Alice. So the terms that are displayed on the slide should look very familiar. When we talk about the achievement gap in education, it's when one group of students, such as students grouped by race or ethnicity or gender, outperforms another group, or the differences in average scores for the two groups and that is statistically significant. We're also probably very familiar with the health disparity in the health system. The healthcare disparities refer to differences in access or availability of facilities and services. Health status disparities refer to the variation in rates of disease, occurrence, and disabilities between socioeconomic and or geographical defined population groups. So again, on this slide, a few terms that we are all probably very familiar with as it touches different elements of our work. Next slide. So these next few slides also come from the groundwater approach as well. So like we shared, racial inequity looks the same across systems. This graph depicts the relative rate index for measures across health, education, criminal justice, child welfare, and economic well-being nationally. The relative rate index captures the increased likelihood that a Black American will experience a bad outcome compared to their white counterpart. And so on the slide, it's a wealth of information, and I won't read it all out to you. I'll just kind of pick a few, but this can help get us data that's really trying to measure what some might call white privilege or white advantage, and how does this experience, how is it relative to other populations, especially Black Americans? So on this slide, we see that Black Americans are 2 times more likely to experience a death from diabetes relative to their white counterpart. Another statistic displayed on this slide is that Black Americans are nearly 3 times more likely to be searched on a routine traffic stop relative to their white counterpart. And so again, along the x-axis, we see the different systems, a few indicators, and then on the y-axis, we're looking at the relative rate index. Next slide. So let's take a closer look at Texas specifically. These are different indicators, but worthy of comparison as well. And you'll see that Black Americans in Texas are 2 to 5 times more likely to experience bad outcomes across systems in Texas. If we're looking at the education system around expulsions due to behavioral issues, that Black Americans or Black students are almost 7 times more likely to receive an expulsion compared to their white counterpart. And if we click in on that CPS, on removals, that Black Americans are nearly 3 times more likely to experience a removal from their household compared to their white counterparts. So let's connect this systems data to Alice. So this should be a slide that you're pretty familiar with if you've jumped into other data in dishes. And this slide depicts our 4 county service area, which includes Waller, Harris, Montgomery, Fort Bend. And Here we're comparing our 2016 data to our 2018 for Texas and Greater Houston as well. So 47% of Greater Houston households struggle to make ends meet. From the 2016 to 2018, only Waller County decreased, but the other 3 counties increased. Montgomery County and Fort Bend County increased to 38%. Harris County increased from 43 to 48%. And then when we average them together, that's when we see the Greater Houston of 47, and then how that places relative to Texas, which is greater. And so often we look at this snapshot and we see the big picture, and we're not really zoning in on the racial disparities or understanding how these different groups, how different racial groups are represented in this number. However, in the next slide, we'll be able to take a look at that. And so along that bottom portion, it tells us the total households that identify as white, Asian, Hispanic, and Black households compared to the Greater Houston households altogether. And so here we see that 32% of total white households in the Greater Houston area are up to or at the ALICE threshold, 37 of Asian households, 58 of Hispanic, and 60 of Black households. And let that just resonate with you and sit with you. And how does that compare to what you might have imagined when we look at that 47%? What's the story behind Hispanics having a larger or greater number than the average, and Black households as well? And then what are some other factors that might play into Asian households 37% and white households 32%? And so this is where we want to have some conversation today, taking in account all that we've already kind of covered. And so this data is very provoking or thought-provoking or even confrontational. And I don't even think that's a negative word, more than it really makes you stop and think about what are all of the layered and complexities that go into this data that really talks about the human experience. So we're going to take a few minutes to think, to pair in little groups, and to share in breakout rooms. Overall, we'll have roughly about 12 minutes for this activity, and we'll be in small groups of 4. And during this time, we want you to work through these questions and share the air as a group. So again, this is very layered and complex, and there isn't one singular solution or entry point or way of thinking, especially at the systems level. I will say that I've read through the chat. I see the organizations that are on the call, and each of our organizations are doing the work to stand between systems and the negative impacts they put on individuals and families we serve. And I want to acknowledge that speaking at the systems level, it can be very overwhelming, but I want to encourage you not to get overwhelmed and to take deep breaths. Take your shoulders down from your ear, relax your jaw, breathe in, and have a nice, healthy exhale. And we really want you to engage in this critical reflection moment. When you close your eyes and you think about Alice, what comes to mind? How did Alice become Alice? From a racial equity lens, what are some of the political, economic, social, cultural, and environmental factors that influences Alice's life? And share other external influences. In the forthcoming conversation, so the slides that are to come, we have more data on white households, Black households, Hispanic and Latinx communities, but there are many more to discuss. And please feel comfortable to bring your own experiences and your reflections when we're talking about all ALICE populations. And so just because the data we have currently presented to us doesn't cover, Middle Eastern, North African, Native American, Indigenous people, Alaskan natives, or Pacific Islanders, if you have that experience, that other context that really depicts the story of Alice and factors that influence the lives of Alice populations, then please let those come out and shine in your breakout rooms. So again, you'll have a total of 12 minutes to work through the questions, and you'll be in groups of about 4. And for your reference, I'll post these 4 questions, but feel free to let that conversation flow organically. And then we will debrief as a large group.
so much. And I remember when you did your kickoff for the campaign, and the gentleman, an Anglo gentleman, was on there and he was talking. And it just reminded both of us that COVID has kind of changed everything. It's like fruit basket turnover. And we have employees that find themselves in this position, not just clients, but that people who never probably even thought that they would be asking for help are now at a disadvantage because they don't know where to go. And that's part of our job. We also realize that uh, we wanted to pat United Way on the back for being able to pivot during this time and realize that it might not be the most popular decision to put, eggs in that basket, but that is really what the United Way was about, was finding those needs and addressing them. So our thing is, we need to be cognizant that it's not just employees, it's not just clients, it could be donors that give to us that have suffered tremendous losses. And so part of our responsibility, not just as United Way partners, but as just human beings, is to make sure that the word gets out and that people know that there are opportunities for help, and that they are not alone.
Thank you, Mary Lou, for sharing that. And even in my own personal reflections on this data and what's happening during 2020 and the pandemic, and I definitely encourage you to dig deeper with the groundwater approach and the rich resources they have on their website. And I know that Jessica's going to share that later, is that while we talk about, in America, statistically speaking, who has the worst outcomes or who's doing worse than the average, and how when we're in situations like this pandemic, where the unemployment rate is skyrocketing, the individuals who were not doing well before are likely not doing any better now and are likely doing worse. However, even those who are on that bubble or who might have been in that sweet spot, so to speak, they're not doing great either. And so how that looks in data is, white Americans, and kind of, I understand that pushback of, hey, it's not great for me, and I understand it's not great for those who might have even more, factors that influence their lives. But take a look globally, which doesn't happen often because, we are really into local data and we're into national data, but take a look globally. And I know that when you hear the news in other countries that are able to provide monthly stipends ongoing to their citizens. And so that's a political or a governmental system that's supporting families abroad that we don't see as widespread or as consistently here. And so that is just a really, in my opinion, for me, it's a rich observation in my reflections. And so I see there's some stuff going on in the chat, and I will push it over to Jessica in a moment because she has some really good data for us to dig into. Diane shared, in thinking about how Alice became Alice, we thought about how some folks went from being comfortable to losing income. And there are those that went from extreme poverty and into Alice, and then back down into poverty, definitely. And it looks like Paul has shared some resources and necessary income for different parts of town. So thank you both for your contributions, and I'm going to hand it over to Jessica.
Thank you, Tiffany, and thank you everyone for your engagement in your breakout sessions to talk more about this and what it looks like, from your view. And we're going to talk about some data, and then we'll go back into breakout rooms towards the end. So quite a lot more ground to cover in our second half. So, Tiffany really laid the groundwork for systems that perpetuate racial disparities. And so we have Kinder Institute that found that where you live determines a great extent to how much access you have to things like quality education, healthcare, housing, public services. And this was actually a call out to a report that they did about like where you live matters, and that 1/3 of the Black population and almost 1/3 of Hispanic population in Texas live in an economically distressed community. And so I think this was like a quote that I just called out because it really speaks to the different areas and then different ways that impacts the different facets for Alice. So when we look at that with the ALICE data, this is the heat map that illustrates the zip codes with the highest concentration of ALICE households across Fort Bend, Harris, Montgomery, and Waller County. If you've been here before, you know we share this map often. So the darker shading indicates a higher concentration of ALICE and below. And if we think back to what we saw with the 45 zip codes in Harris County that are economically distressed from the Kinder report, you know, many of which are seen here in this backward C, this backward orange C. That's 8 are majority Black and 28 are majority Hispanic. And so this backward C also reflects community indicators with high prevalence of households that say don't have internet, don't have health insurance, they have poor health care, like poor healthcare outcomes like maternal mortality. So we really want to keep that in mind as we kind of think of not only what impacts, but also where the impact happens. And many groups are disproportionately a high percentage of ALICE and below. And so at the beginning, we showed that breakdown. And so we saw Black and Hispanic households, and really racial and ethnic disparities and hardship are growing and they're not shrinking. The ALICE research unequivocally documents the persistent and widening disparities. So here, let's look at Black households, which we see that 60% across Greater Houston are unable to afford basic household necessities. And we can drill down and see what does that look like in each county, which is really kind of interesting. So we see here that Fort Bend and Montgomery County are below that 60% mark compared to the 4-county area. But Waller has 68% that are, you know, of their Black households are ALICE and below. And then Harris County is at 62%. And I really want to take a moment here to talk about and identify the unique factors that might be attributing to this. So, you know, as Tiffany shared, you know, everybody has their unique experiences, their own innate wisdom that they can bring to this. So please don't be shy, use the chat, or you can, you know, use the raise hand feature to unmute and just, you know, share out what are some of the unique factors impacting Black households.
I guess I'm wanting to have a better understanding of the question. Are we looking at why Black families and Black households in Montgomery and Fort Bend are, you know, experiencing a lower rate of ALICE or qualifying for ALICE?
It doesn't have to be specifically those 2 counties. It can be just collectively, what are the unique factors impacting Black households? Okay. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, because I was just thinking in terms of, you know, in terms of outward movement from Houston, you know, Houston proper, we would say, you know, there was a lot of movement to Fort Bend in terms of Missouri City and so forth. I would think in the 80s and 90s, where you had the community overall accessing higher levels of education and just the outward flow. So I guess that was just more from a historic perspective. So,
yeah, great. That's a good point. Thank you. That outward flow. Also in the chat, you know, I see policy issues, social mores. I might have to explain that one for me, Camilla.
Social mores.
Mores. Okay, thank you.
And underemployment. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And then
no problem. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And then also, Irene, thinking about ALICE, I wonder about variables associated with how well systems handle access to services in relation to collective trauma and I'm not going to pronounce it right, but Irene, do you want to share a little more about what you were thinking?
Yeah, I just wonder, I mean, this is coming from the lens of trauma. I work for a family violence center and I engage in research on topics related to trauma. So I'm kind of really interested already in this idea of collective trauma and how communities experience this in relation to how services are provided to be culturally appropriate to that community. And so, and then related to acculturation. Acculturation is just the way, for instance, an immigrant comes to the United States and say they're coming from Syria and they don't speak English and they follow the Muslim faith, and now they have 2 children and they need to send them to school to be educated in the United States. So how do you navigate the the culture from your home culture to your guest culture in the United States, and how do communities work together to facilitate that kind of like healthy merging of cultures and to be successful in living in, in the Western culture. So so it's more about how do the communities facilitate those processes, and then secondarily, like that collective group trauma of having that botched acculturation, how does that affect communities and the way they access services and the way the services are provided to them? And that kind of historical trajectory, what does that mean for those communities' overall outcomes? So in thinking about that, thinking about systems and especially through a racial lens, I really, I think we have to look at like the political ideologies and the, economic, the way we embed, free market capitalism into our systems and what we say is important. So I think all of those, I mean, you could talk about this for hours. And so, I mean, that's sort of just what I meant, is like thinking about those variables and how they kind of are embedded in that process of how communities respond to systems and how systems respond to those communities.
Yeah, no, thank you, Irene. I really appreciate bringing that up. I mean, you are definitely hitting a nail on the head. And I think that goes into, really the utilization of this the awareness of it, right? So now we know these things, like these are things that are not new. I called them unique factors, but really they're the factors, they're the realities. And so how do we take that into practice to address the systems or address the trauma and make things more cultural humility lens as we work with families and individuals. So thank you. And really there's a lot more going on in chat. I appreciate what people are putting. And these are just some of the unique factors that we pulled together, but there still are so many unique factors. And I think they're individual factors as well. But we can also look at Hispanic households. So kind of similar, where there's 58% Hispanic households that are below the ALICE threshold in 2018. But really we drill and look into the 4 county areas, like for each county, and I don't have to drill far, right? So you see that, 55% for Fort Bend and Montgomery County are ALICE and below for Hispanic families or households, and then 59% for Harris and Waller. So there aren't very many differences there. So same question, but through the Hispanic household lens, what are some factors or unique factors that are attributing to financial hardship for those families? So some that we pulled together are, documentation status. So immigration or migration, deportation, the administration policies surrounding that, as well as coming from diverse origins. So foreign born and how that can impact, how they're treated in different systems. And then English as your second language and just being unfairly treated if, you're not speaking English, or how the language barrier to resources, right? Thank you, Diana, for including that. And if there's any others people want to put in the chat, please feel free. We are a little behind on time, so I'm going to keep moving.
Yeah, I would think, we look, as I was been discussed over the last several months, the Hispanic community or Latino community is not a monolith in terms of what's occurred, because you have those Latinos or communities here in the Houston area who have been here for generations, and they start to look across the family and across generations, they start to look at other communities that have experienced cycles of poverty. So again, those previous things that were mentioned in terms of the justice system, lack of resources, in terms of, barriers that the families have hit generationally, which impacts the psyche of the overall family in terms of the following, from great grandmother to grandmother, great grandparents to grandparents to parents to the child, So those same factors that were listed for for the Black community areas also impact the Latino communities based on how many generations they've lived in the area, so, or they've been here in Texas, Houston, Harris County, whatever it may be, or in the U.S. So.
Right. Thank you. So we'll continue to look at this. So I really appreciate the change over time that we see, because I mean, I think it was even you, Paul, at the beginning talked about, just the migration out of the like the major city of Harris County, Houston, into the suburbs. And so we see this from our change of time, right? Change over time. So from 2010 to 2018, we see the most change for Fort Bend County. So across Black and Hispanic households. So here we see Fort Bend had an increase of 71% for those that are Alice and below. And then for Black households saw an increase of 36%. But then on the flip side, if you look at Waller County, it only increased for Hispanic households by 1%, but then actually saw a decrease by 16% of Black households. So it's just kind of interesting when you think about that change over time and what this cumulative change looks like for each individual county. And we'll share the link to these expanded county pages so that way you can, kind of look through and see what does that change look like over time. So we also know that at the beginning, Alice is about people, and we see the ripple effect when Alice has limited financial resources. And you guys have shared about this quite a bit. So it impacts the person, where they live, their mobility, their access to things like healthy food, childcare. And the 2018 analysis by Economic Policy Institute found that 48% of Texas residents live in a childcare desert. And so this percentage is even higher for Hispanic families than families in lowest income neighborhoods, as well as those living in rural areas. And I know someone mentioned that, I think, in the chat about the impact for rural areas. But the cost of childcare relative to family income also continues to increase, with higher rates of childcare in urban areas, and then a greater resiliency on family childcare homes in rural areas. And this also continues on. So if you joined us for COVID-19 and Alice intersection, you'll remember that, a lot of workers are now working remote or telework if that's an option for them. But before COVID, that really wasn't, we were already kind of behind at a deficit. So this research right here from the Labor Bureau statistics found that really that 19.7% of Black workers and only 16.2% of Hispanic workers were able to telework, compared to a higher percentage for Asian and white workers. And so this really just reiterates that how behind the curve before the pandemic, disproportionate populations were impacted. And we also, we've said it again time and time that Alice lives on the financial edge. We're building a savings for an emergency is difficult, if not impossible. So that's why it's important to have access to financial tools like a match savings program. And then also Alice, this low income also prevents Alice from investing in the future, when living paycheck to paycheck is really the reality. So that means, not having funds or savings for higher education, having a small business, retirement, or even building generational wealth. So we kind of look at that from two lenses. So we can see here that, putting it together, Alice families that have zero or even negative wealth live on the financial edge, just one minor economic setback or financial emergency away from disaster. The Institute for Policy Studies reinforced that Black and Hispanic families are more likely to be in this uncertain situation. So the proportion of Black families with zero or negative wealth, meaning the value of their debt exceeds the value of their assets, rose by 8.5% to 37% between 1983 and 2016. And then for Hispanic families, it declined by 19% over 30 years, but it's still more than twice the rate for white families. Then on the other side, we can look at the total wealth and how that impacts home ownership. So it's heavily skewed toward white families. In 2016, 72% of white families own their home, compared to just 44% of Black families. And then for Hispanic home ownership, it increased, but it's still far lower than the rate for white families. And so this is on a national level, but Kinder did a report, it's called the State of Housing, which shows the Black home ownership dropped significantly. And while all groups saw declines in home ownership from 2010 to 2018, Black home ownership fell the most and to the lowest percentage overall. And so we'll provide more links to this so you can read more and explore. But we are to our second breakout, which is kind of our last thing. And really, this is more of we have 9 minutes, so this will be a speed activity, but I want to take the next 3 minutes to really talk more about what does it mean for us, right? So we talked about the systems, we talked about where you live matters, the groups that are disproportionately and how they're disproportionately impacted. So how can we create solutions to bridge the gap toward racial disparities and financial hardship? So we'll take 3 minutes. So with your mics off and cameras off, I know most folks have their cameras off, but grab a pen and a piece of paper or open up your Paint app and draw the elements that are essential to a community where Alice can thrive. You know, keep in mind the disparities that we discussed, but what are key elements like transportation, food resources, childcare options, educations, jobs, air quality, connectivity. Pull from what you know, that innate wisdom that you have to reflect on those items. So I'll give you until about 12:55. Okay, so we have about 1 more minute. Hopefully you are creating a drawing or maybe just listing out. And I've stopped sharing screen because time is not on our side today. We wanted to cover a lot. And so we won't have time for to go into breakout rooms to share, but hopefully those that are all 63 of us can be one big breakout room. And so if anyone would like to share their drawing or share out their list of key elements they put, please feel free to unmute, unmute, go on camera and report out.
Hi, Jessica. This is Laura with Goodwill. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm on my couch, so sorry, I'm not sharing, wasn't sharing my screen. Just I'm so comfortable trying to stay warm like everyone. You know, I was thinking about, well, yes, education, the location where you live, access to transportation, just all of that. But I got to thinking about also, and God, I hate to say it this way because it just sounds so, it's uncomfortable for me to even say this out loud, but recently my child who is going to college, I was, looking at financial aid, knowing full and well that because of what my husband and I earned, we probably were not going to qualify. But I came across a friend who chose to not claim and live separately. They are married, but her child is getting all kinds of financial aid. So sometimes the choices that we make, and I'm sorry, it sounds ugly. I'm not comfortable in saying this. There's so much opportunity out there for single mothers, who are not claiming the income of their spouses. It's a system. It's designed, and I think it makes it easy for people to make that choice, where there are plenty that don't. I know that. But it just, I'm struggling with that right now. My son and my husband and I could use the help. We could use some financial aid. We can use other things to help my son. And I don't have that opportunity. So at the same time, when I hear about families that come in who know how to work the system, it's frustrating. So I think there's a lot of opportunity out there, but I think there's also we have to also understand and start taking some accountability and responsibility for that as well. So is it a choice? Is it that there's not enough programs, not enough funding, not enough? What about the middle class? Where do we get and go above from that as well? Because now I'm struggling we've been saving, but it's not always enough. So I'm sorry, just had to throw that out there, another perspective.
No, I appreciate you sharing that perspective. And just because that's the world we live in, that's the reality, that, even if you do make above a certain amount and you don't need certain benefits or have access to those benefits, it still doesn't mean that, you have what's necessary for things like higher education, right? So no, I thank you for sharing that. Access is really, really big part of that. And so I'm seeing that in the chat too. So it's also access to education, mental health and physical health, employment, parks, communities, green spaces.
I also have, can you see my drawing? Okay, that's supposed to be Capitol Hill. Oh. And so here's transportation and housing and work and school. But I think also what I've been really having private discussions about, especially with the struggle because some of us are landing in Alice. I mean, even though we're in the work. And so the big push for me right now is, we know what the problems are, but what are the solutions around them? And how are we collectively going to push this needle forward? And I'm not sure if it's going to continue to rely on government to come up with the solutions. I think it's going to take each and every one of us to step into the fold to find those solutions, to find common ground in terms of what our expertise is. So some of us are data analysts, some of us are CDL drivers, some of us work on farms, some of us are school teachers. And maybe it's going to take the community to step up and say, you know what, maybe thanks, but we've dealt with years of policy and I don't know, we've been trying to make it work. Maybe it's going to take lending our wages to the issue so that we can bridge this divide, because it just seems like we keep pounding and pounding and pounding. I even made a suggestion when I was talking with Prosperity Now. I was on one of the calls and I was saying that maybe it will take going back to like Little House on the Prairie and creating schools, in homes. Maybe it's going to take that. So though I drew this picture, this is kind of where it all begins and ends, and then of course our participation. So.
Thank you, Carmela. That's a great way to wrap it up. I think it's across everything. It's the policies, but then also boots on the ground and what we can do from what's within our control, our center of the world, right? So thank you so much. Thank you all. I've put in the chat, this has been the fastest hour, I think, of my whole day, probably for my whole month. So thank you all for joining us. We'll have another session in January where we'll talk about seniors, older adults in the intersection of Alice. I did drop in the chat the feedback form. Definitely want to hear your feedback. We're always growing from these and how we share this data. So thank you so much. And we hope everyone has a happy, healthy, safe holiday season. And thank you all. And thank you, Tiffany.
Happy holidays, everybody.